Today I'm going to be going over my final product for the Game Engine Design class, which is my Game Engine game. As you can see, we have an improved start menu. The camera just spins in a circle, looking at the skybox, so the skybox looks like it's moving. The menu now just has start game, join game, or I can quit. The volume can be moved up and down. If I click on join game, it takes you to a menu where you're able to join a multiplayer game. If you type in a bad address, the engine is just going to shut down. You can type your address in the box here. So let's say I'm going to be on loopback 255. I can type in as many characters as I want up to whatever the length of an IP address can be. And in this case with IPv4, we only have 15 characters, so I can only type in 15. Join will send a message to whatever address I put in there. The port is built in, and it'll request the terrain seed. I got stuck at trying to send back a reply. For some reason, I couldn't get a reply to send back with the seed for the terrain, so the terrain never built, and it's just a mess. But I ran out of time to work on that, so at least I still have a deliverable product. Now, if we start game, it's still going to take a minute to load because of how big the terrain is and all the things that are now on the terrain. So now that we're in the world, this is my game character, or at least an attempt at a game character. I made this model in Blender. It's just 3 balls with slightly different shaded colors on it. As you can see, the terrain is a little different. I now have coloring using an HSL coloring to RGB, and it kind of shades from a light green to a darker green up to the higher points. I have a water plane, as you can see right here, that is kind of going up and down. If you watch closely here, it'll cover the sandy part, and then eventually it'll go back down. So the water kind of breathes. The way I did this was I made a flat plane that was just blue, and then I made it a little transparent so you could see underneath it, and I changed the color of the ground down here to look more sandy, like what underwater would look like. So every engine update, the water level has a chance to go up or down depending on which direction it's headed in. I just have a boolean to tell it what direction to head in, and depending on that, it'll either add or subtract a very minuscule amount to the coordinate. And eventually, the water gets high, and then it'll go back down. It does this to add a breathing effect to the water, just so it's not so stagnant. As for the terrain, not only do I have the coloring done, but I had to use a shader to do that. I found a point vertex shader in the engine already, and I kind of edited that a little bit to allow for these colors to come in and use the actual shading property from the shader, so that light can add a little bit of coloration to it based on where the light is. The light in general comes from up here. I just have a point light to kind of shade everything in the same direction. I found that with how I was setting up my viewing distance, having a directional light wouldn't work. In here there's also trees and rocks now. The trees and rocks, I also made those in Blender. I colored them with some UV mapping in Blender. I learned a lot of things about Blender doing this project. But the terrain is created with a noise function to give it the differing heights. I use simplex noise for that. I talked about that in my last video. The trees also use a noise function. I pretty much just overlay that noise function with this noise function. And if the new noise function has certain values and the height of the terrain is a certain value, then I can put a tree there. I also have some spacing requirements between the trees so they're not too close. Otherwise, I'd get a million little trees in this one spot. The rocks are also using a noise function. They come after the trees, and they also make sure that they're not too close to trees. That way we don't have a bunch of models just kind of like touching each other or inside of each other. Another thing I worked on a little bit was a debug menu for in-game. It'll tell me my frame rate and my coordinates. Now, it's not extremely helpful, but it was a little helpful with trying to create this particle, these wind particles. Um, I know you can't actually see wind, but to kind of make the illusion of wind, I tried adding in particles that moved across the map to make it look like it was windy. The particles definitely add to the scene. They may not be the prettiest thing or the most wind-like looking thing, but I think it succeeds in its job of creating the illusion of some air flowing through the world. One of the things that I spent most of my time on for this project was just trying to get it to build in release mode, which is what I'm running right now. The game is in release mode. My problem was that I didn't actually have a release library or a lib file to connect to. It kept connecting to my debug file, and so it wouldn't work. So I had to go through, manually set all of the libraries for the release build to be release libraries. But that ended up being a problem for a few other people too, and I got to help them fix that. The wind particles use Flex to create their movement. Flex is also by Nvidia, just like the PhysX, and I integrated that into the engine so that I could get the movement of the particles. If you look close enough, you can see the particles spawning in the background there. They spawn in every so often. There's a random chance that they do. And when they get created, they just fly across the map over there because I gave the particles some gravity. The last thing I did before I failed at making multiplayer was I added in this character model, and I added camera movement to the character model. The camera follows the character, and I remapped all of the movement keys to move the character model instead of the camera. And then I also mapped the mouse movement to move around the model. The last thing I needed to show off was this model that my friend made for me to use in the engine. Now, I don't personally like it, but he thinks it's funny, so I guess I can just show it off. It's just my face mapped to a icosphere. Um, yeah, not the prettiest thing, but it's there.